Chris was a 22-year-old guy, just trying to get by in the big city. Working his main job during the day in an office, he would hit the streets at night, making deliveries for Doordash. It wasn't glamorous, but it was easy money, especially since he was good at it. He was fast, efficient, and always made sure to pack his thermal bag properly, keeping his customers' food warm and fresh. His tips were usually generous, because he went the extra mile, always giving his best. The money he made helped pay off the car loan that had been haunting him for months. He'd park his car in the driveway, turn off the engine, and sit there for a second, reminding himself of his goal. It was simple: pay off the car debt, save some extra cash, and one day, maybe, get out of the city and start fresh somewhere quieter. For now, though, he was content to hustle. On the night everything changed, the city felt oppressive. It was one of those humid Houston nights, thick with moisture and the smell of stale air. The streets were barely lit, and the usual hum of the city felt distant. It was close to midnight when Chris got the order. Just another delivery, he thought. The app showed an address far on the edge of town, a neighborhood Chris had never been to before, but the payout was good, and the customer had a high rating. Another night, another delivery, he muttered to himself, grabbing his insulated bag and heading out. The neighborhood looked abandoned when he pulled in. The street lamps flickered, casting eerie shadows across empty streets lined with rundown houses. Most of the windows were dark, and the ones that weren't showed nothing but the glow of cheap bulbs that barely lit the rooms. The air felt heavier here, like it was soaked in something sinister. Chris pulled up to the house, a dilapidated two-story with overgrown weeds spilling onto the front porch. The porch light flickered in a sickly yellow hue, casting long shadows over the cracked steps. It looked like no one had bothered to maintain the house in years. He checked the app. The customer had requested that the food be left on the doorstep. No knock, no ring. Just drop the food and go. Strange, Chris thought, but he shrugged it off. It was another delivery. He didn't think much of it. He got out of his car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The moment he stepped onto the porch, a shiver ran up his spine. It was as if the house itself was watching him, breathing down his neck. The temperature dropped, even though it was still hot and sticky in the air. Chris shook his head and tried to ignore it. It was just the heat getting to him. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow everything around it. He placed the food on the doorstep, his hand trembling just slightly as he adjusted the bag. Something about the silence felt wrong, unnerving. No sound. No movement. "Hello?" Chris called out, though he knew no one would answer. He had been on enough deliveries to know that people don't usually open the door for food delivery. His phone buzzed. A notification from the app: "Please wait. Customer will be with you shortly." Chris glanced up, but no one came. He stared at the door, confused. What the hell? The message made no sense. Suddenly, the door creaked open, just a little more. The dim light from inside illuminated a figure standing in the doorway, barely visible, just a shadow of someone too tall, too thin. Chris felt a sudden pang of fear claw at his gut. But it was too late. The figure lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and pulling him inside with terrifying force. His heart raced as he tried to break free, but the grip was ironclad. What the hell?" Chris gasped, struggling to breathe. His arms flailed as he was yanked into the house. He could smell the stale, musty air, the rotting wood, and something else, something metallic. He looked up, his mind struggling to make sense of the scene. The inside of the house was worse than he could have imagined. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floors stained, and the air was thick with decay. And then, he saw it, on the far wall, a set of photographs, dark, twisted portraits of people whose faces had been slashed out with sharp, jagged lines. He tried to scream, but the figure's grip tightened. A woman stepped out from the shadows, her face gaunt and hollow, eyes wide with manic intensity. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and she grinned in a way that made Chris's stomach turn. "You're the last one," she whispered, voice rasping like it hadn't been used in years. Before Chris could react, the man who had pulled him inside grabbed a sharp, rusty knife from the kitchen counter. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to free himself. But it was no use. They were too strong, and the fear was paralyzing him. The last thing he heard before the pain overwhelmed him was a sickening chuckle from the woman. The next morning, Chris's car was still parked on the street in front of the house. His phone lay abandoned on the driver's seat, screen cracked and shattered. The app continued to show his status as active, the usual delivery notification scrolling by, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded the night before. And for the rest of his life, Chris would never look at Doordash the same way. Every time he saw an order come through, the hairs on his neck would rise, and a cold sweat would prick at his skin. The memory of that night would follow him wherever he went, a dark shadow, always reminding him that sometimes, a side hustle can cost you more than you ever bargained for. It was the night before Christmas, and Sarah, a Doordash driver, had been on the road for hours. The cold air bit at her as she drove through the empty streets of the city. The last-minute shoppers had all but disappeared, leaving behind the quiet hum of streetlights and the occasional distant car. Christmas Eve was usually a night Sarah enjoyed, one of the few times she could drive without the usual traffic. But tonight, something felt different. Sarah glanced at the time, almost midnight. She checked her phone. A new order popped up, and as always, it had the allure of extra pay. "It's Christmas Eve," she muttered. "It'll be over soon." The order came through from an unfamiliar area, a residential neighborhood on the edge of town. The app only showed an address, and oddly, no contact details or tip information. Just an address, and a promise of generous compensation. The only detail that stood out was the payment amount. It was too good to pass up. Last one of the night, she told herself. She tapped the button to accept the delivery, already dreading the cold winds that would greet her when she stepped outside. But as a Doordash driver, this was the job, and she needed the money. As she navigated through the quiet streets, the city seemed abandoned. No Christmas lights twinkling in windows, no cars on the roads. Even the few shops still open appeared more like ghost towns than festive businesses. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But it wasn't until she reached the destination that the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The house was old, faded white paint peeling from the walls and a crooked fence that lined the front yard. The lawn was overgrown, and the windows were covered by heavy curtains, blocking out any trace of life. There were no other houses nearby, and the streetlights did little to penetrate the thick shadows that consumed the area. Sure is a weird part of town, Sarah thought as she parked in front of the house. The address matched, so she grabbed the order from the back seat and headed toward the front door. The porch light flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the worn-out wood. There was no bell, just an old, weathered sign nailed to the door, "Please knock." No phone calls. She raised her fist and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing unnervingly in the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened. The house stood still, almost too still. Sarah's breath formed a mist in the freezing air as she waited, glancing around. The silence felt suffocating, like the world had frozen for just a moment. Then, the door creaked open slowly. There was no one on the other side, just an empty hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. "Hello?" she called out, stepping cautiously over the threshold. There was no reply. The door creaked shut behind her with a strange finality. The sound seemed too loud, too deliberate. Sarah stood still, her eyes darting around. She could hear the faint rustle of something upstairs, but there was no movement down below. She glanced at the food she was delivering, still warm in the bag, but the longer she stood there, the more uncomfortable she became. Maybe they're busy, she thought. Maybe I should just leave the food here. But there was something unsettling about the quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. It wasn't the kind of eerie silence that filled an empty house, it was something worse. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to do something. Just as she turned to leave, a soft sound, like a whisper, came from the top of the stairs. "Are you lost, Sarah?" Her heart leaped into her throat. The voice was soft, almost childlike, and yet there was something distinctly wrong about it. The name she had heard, her own, was said with an unnatural calm, like someone had been waiting for her arrival. She spun around, searching for the source, but the house remained still and empty. The stairwell led to nothing but darkness. There was no movement. No sign of life. Sarah took a step backward, but the floor creaked beneath her foot, and her eyes widened. The door to the house, she had left it open, hadn't she, was now fully closed. And locked. She yanked at the handle. Nothing. Her pulse quickened, and a sense of panic began to set in. The whispering voice echoed again, this time louder, "You shouldn't have come, Sarah. No one leaves." Her eyes darted toward the stairs. The faintest shadow moved at the top of the landing. Something was up there, something that didn't belong. "Who is that?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Is someone playing a joke on me?" But the air was thick with silence again. The only sound was the pounding of her own heart, loud in her ears. She pressed her back against the door, hoping somehow it would open, praying for an escape. The voice came again, soft but clear, "You're already too late." A cold gust of air blew past her, and she spun around, nearly dropping the food. The air seemed to grow colder, a chill that sank deep into her bones. The shadow at the top of the stairs was closer now, a vague outline in the darkness. "I need to leave," she whispered to herself, stepping back. But her feet wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding her in place, a presence that seemed to seep from the walls. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, and the door creaked open, just a little. Not enough to escape, but enough to see something she hadn't noticed before. A figure appeared in the doorway, standing just out of sight, staring at her. It was a man. Tall, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that sent a cold shiver down her spine. He stepped forward, his footsteps slow, deliberate. "Did you bring the food?" His voice was flat, void of emotion. Sarah stammered, taking another step back, but the air around her felt heavy, suffocating. The figure took another step forward. "You'll deliver the food, but you'll never leave," he said, his voice cold and distant. Panic surged through her as she finally turned, racing toward the back door. It was locked, too. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She was trapped in this dark, empty house, just like the others before her. The figure stepped closer, and Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that no one had ever ordered food here. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a trap. And she had walked right into it. The night had fallen heavy and dark, and the city was quiet, too quiet. Ethan, a Doordash driver, had already completed most of his deliveries. The rush hour crowd had long since dissipated, and the streets were now eerily empty. He glanced at the clock in his car, 11:47 p.m. Just one more delivery, and then he could head home to bed. The order came through, and as usual, it seemed too good to pass up. A quick look at the app showed a hefty payout for a single delivery, but the address was unfamiliar, far on the outskirts of the city. He hesitated for just a moment. Something about it seemed off, but the extra pay was tempting, and he was only a few miles away. With a sigh, Ethan accepted the order, not knowing this decision would change everything. The winding roads outside the city were dimly lit by the occasional street lamp, their yellow glow failing to pierce the thick fog rolling in from the nearby hills. The further Ethan drove, the more isolated the area became. There were no other cars on the road, and no signs of life. The houses here were few and far between, spaced out by long stretches of overgrown grass and empty fields. As he neared the destination, he saw the house in the distance. It was large, old, and had a Gothic look to it, its windows dark, the exterior chipped and faded. The front yard was unkempt, with weeds growing through cracks in the driveway. There was no other house in sight. Who orders at a place like this? Ethan muttered to himself, shaking his head. But the app assured him the address was correct, so he drove up the long, uneven driveway and parked in front of the house. The front porch light flickered weakly, barely lighting the path to the door. Ethan grabbed the food from the back seat and walked up to the entrance, feeling the weight of the darkness around him. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faint, like decaying wood. There was no bell. Just a small, weathered sign near the door that read, "Leave the food on the doorstep." No need to knock. He glanced around, feeling a strange unease as he placed the food on the ground in front of the door. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant rustling of trees in the wind. No lights in the windows, no movement inside the house. Who lives here? Ethan thought, stepping back toward his car. Just as he turned to leave, the door creaked open slightly. Not enough to fully open, but enough to make him stop dead in his tracks. From the crack in the door, a pale hand reached out, slowly, as if unsure, to grab the bag of food. Ethan watched in stunned silence, his heartbeat quickening. No one had come to the door. No one had even greeted him. The hand was thin, bony, almost translucent in the dim light. It wrapped around the bag like it was a lifeline, pulling it inside with eerie slowness. Ethan's eyes were wide as he stared at the door. He should leave. This was too strange. Too unsettling. But something rooted him to the spot, some pull he couldn't explain. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, making him jump back. His mind raced. Was someone playing a joke on him? Maybe the whole house was abandoned, and he had just delivered food to an empty home. But something felt wrong. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if the entire world had paused for just a moment. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. The app had updated, there was a new message. He pulled out his phone and opened the app. The message read, "Thank you for the delivery, Ethan. We've been waiting for you." His blood ran cold. He hadn't entered any information into the app when accepting the order, no personal details beyond the address. How could they know his name? His pulse quickened as his eyes darted back to the house. The windows were now pitch black. No shadows, no light, just inky void staring back at him. Suddenly, a voice, a soft whisper, came from the direction of the house. "We're hungry, Ethan." His heart skipped a beat. The voice had come from inside the house. But there was no one in sight. He strained his ears, listening carefully. Another whisper, this time louder, "Closer, it's your turn." Ethan's hand trembled as he grabbed the door handle of his car. He couldn't leave fast enough. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he slammed the door shut and started the engine, his foot pressing the gas pedal without a second thought. The car jerked forward, tires screeching against the gravel, his eyes never leaving the darkened house in the rearview mirror. But as he drove away, a chill ran through him. The whispering voice, faint but clear, echoed in his mind. "We're waiting for you." The further Ethan drove, the more the words echoed in his head. He could have sworn he heard faint knocks on his windows, but every time he looked, there was nothing. The darkened house, still visible in his rearview mirror, seemed to loom closer with each passing mile, as if someone, was following him. His hands gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles ached, and his thoughts raced. Was he being haunted by something beyond the world he knew? Or was there something far worse waiting for him when he returned home?